You are 17 when the war stops being a sound coming out of a radio cabinet and becomes something that walks through your front door. Before that morning, your days in Bremen follow a small, steady rhythm that feels like it will never end. You rise before the sun to help your father raise the metal shutters of his bicycle repair shop. The smell of oil is already on your fingers before you sit down to eat. Your mother, Marta, scolds you for cleaning your hands on your trouser leg instead of the rag hanging by the door. Your little brother, Emil, trails behind you through the shop, pestering you with questions about every gear, spoke, and dented headlamp on the workbench. You act like his questions wear you out. He is not fooled for a second. In the evenings, your mother keeps a pot of soup warm on the stove, while your father sits at the table with the newspaper, saying very little. His name is Wilhelm. He carries 2 missing fingers and a deep distrust of speeches about national glory, both souvenirs of the First War. Whenever a column of officials passes through the street waving banners, he pulls the shop door shut and waits them out. Once, when you ask him why, he tells you that a man who needs that many flags is usually covering something up. You understand, even at your age, that this is not a safe thing to say out loud. You do not yet understand how unsafe. At school, your teachers describe a nation that was humiliated and is now being reborn. At the youth meetings, older boys tell you that obeying without question is its own kind of courage. You learn marching songs, formation drills, map reading, and slogans, and you learn to throw your arm into a salute long before anyone explains what refusing to do it might cost your family. A few of the boys around you believe every word of it. Others are only going through the motions. Most of you, if you are honest, can no longer tell the difference. Your best friend is Lucas Reinhardt, whose father works for the railway. Lucas is lean, quick-eyed, and constitutionally unable to leave any piece of machinery closed. Radios interest him more than anything else in the world, and he has built a working receiver out of scrap wire, a cracked speaker, and parts quietly removed from his father's desk drawer. At night, the two of you sneak up into the attic above the shop and turn the dial with the volume low, hunting for foreign broadcasts through the hiss. Tuning into a station from London is against the law, which is exactly what makes it feel like the only honest thing you hear all week. One station insists Germany is losing ground. The other insists victory is close. Lucas laughs and says one of them has to be lying. Your father, listening from the staircase, tells you it is probably both of them, only by different amounts. By 1943, the air raids over Bremen have grown constant. Sirens cut through dinner, windows stay taped and covered, and whole blocks vanish between one sunrise and the next. You learn to sleep in your clothes so you can reach the cellar without wasting a second. One night, a blast throws you clear out of your bed and rips the roof off a building 2 doors down. In the daylight, you help dig through the wreckage with your bare hands, while a woman keeps calling out for her daughter and nobody has an answer for her. After that morning, the promises about a clean and certain victory get harder and harder to believe. Then the envelope comes. You have just turned 18. Your mother turns it over in her hands and sits down before she opens it. Your father is standing by the workbench holding a wrench he has forgotten he is even holding. You have been called up for military service. 2 days later, the same letter arrives for Lucas. For one brief moment, it almost feels like, good luck. Whatever is coming, at least you will not face it by yourself. Your mother does not share that comfort. She packs more food than you can possibly carry, men's socks the army will replace within a week anyway, and asks you the same 3 questions over and over, because there are no real answers to give her. Your father brings you into the clothes shop the night before you leave. He does not hand you a keepsake or a photograph. He hands you a warning instead. Do not mistake staying alive for being in the right, he tells you, and do not let another man's certainty stand in for your own conscience. You had hoped for something simpler than that. Stay low, come home in one piece, be brave when it counts. Instead, he leaves you with a warning you do not yet know how to carry. That warning turns out to be the whole shape of what is coming, though it will take a train, a beach, and a stranger's kitchen table before you understand it. If you want to see where a story like this actually goes, and what it really meant to wear that uniform, stay with this channel. We tell these histories in full every single week. Training does not wait long. Within days, you are shaved, inspected, and folded into a training battalion in northern Germany, alongside thousands of other 18-year-olds who, only weeks earlier, were still delivering bread or repairing bicycles. What the recruiting posters never mention is that most of you have already spent 6 months in the Reich labor service. swinging shovels on road crews and drainage ditches before you ever touched a rifle, a mandatory stretch of manual labor worked into the system specifically to make military discipline feel like a relief by comparison. Now the discipline arrives in earnest. You learn to march, dig, strip a rifle blind, throw a grenade, and above all, obey an order before your mind has time to question it. Lucas is pulled aside for radio training almost immediately, since he understands frequencies and vacuum tubes better than most of the instructors. He is proud of the assignment for exactly 1 day, until a veteran quietly tells him that radio operators draw enemy fire precisely because officers cluster around them. It is one of the first uncomfortable facts of the war you learn secondhand, before you have even left Germany. Your platoon sergeant is Karl Brenner, 31 years old, built like a doorframe, and worn thin by campaigns in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union that he refuses to discuss unless someone asks him something foolish enough to deserve an answer. When one recruit asks how many enemy soldiers he has killed, Brenner tells him that counting would not do either of you any good. He drives you harder than the other instructors, makes you dig positions deeper and carry more than your share, and for a while you assume he simply enjoys it. Only later do you understand he is trying to keep as many of you alive as his limited authority allows. In early 1944, your unit ships out to Normandy, and the French countryside is nothing like what you pictured. Green pasture, stone farmhouses, orchards heavy with unripe fruit, all of it undisturbed except for the German road signs, checkpoints, and soldiers billeted inside schoolhouses and barns. Local civilians look at you in ways you cannot fully translate. Some refuse to meet your eyes. Others hold your gaze a beat too long. Officers describe the Atlantic Wall stretching along the coast as an unbroken line of concrete bunkers, mines, and artillery that will drown any invasion in the surf before it reaches dry sand. This is largely theater. Along most of the Norman coastline, the wall exists in patches rather than as a continuous line. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has been touring the region for months, complaining in writing that the fortifications are undermanned, underarmed, and years behind where High Command claims they are. None of this reaches you. You are only told to keep digging. For months, that is exactly what you do. Trenches, gun pits, communication lines strung between bunkers, ammunition crates carried until your shoulders bruise. Lucas spends his days coaxing worn-out radio sets back to life with spare parts that should have been replaced a year earlier. At night, your unit sleeps inside a requisitioned farmhouse, while the family who owns it, the Laurents, are pushed into 2 back rooms. The father barely speaks to any of you. His daughter Claire looks at your uniform the way you might look at something you stepped in by accident. One evening, a letter from Emile slips out of your pocket, and Claire picks it up before you can stop her. She cannot read the German, but she recognizes a child's crayon drawing of 2 bicycles under the words, and for half a second her expression softens before she hands it back and walks away without a word. Lucas notices and tells you, only half joking, that you have just been promoted to almost human in the eyes of one French teenager. You tell him to be quiet. The moment stays with you anyway. Rumors fill the waiting the way weather fills an empty sky. The invasion will land at Calais. No Normandy. No Norway. It will come tomorrow. It will never come at all. Lucas keeps writing 2 drafts of every letter home. One for the censors, describing adequate food and steady morale, and one for the truth, describing exhaustion, endless aircraft overhead, and the wall nobody on the ground actually believes is finished. He never mails the honest versions. He folds them into envelopes addressed to his mother and hides the stack in a canvas pouch under the radio's spare batteries. When you ask why write letters that can never be sent, he tells you that someday somebody ought to know what he actually thought. On the night of June 5th, 1944, rain pounds the coast, and officers assure everyone that weather this rough rules out any landing. Brenner has you sleep in your boots regardless. Shortly after midnight, the sky fills with engines. Not a handful of planes, but hundreds, low enough to shake the farmhouse windows. Word arrives, in pieces, of paratroopers already on the ground inland and fighting, breaking out near the river bridges. Lucas hunches over the radio, trying to sort real orders from noise. Before sunrise, the naval bombardment begins, distant at first, then close enough to crack plaster off the ceiling. You run for your position, carrying ammunition while the entire western horizon flashes without pause. From higher ground, you finally see the water, and it is covered. Not with a few ships, but with battleships, destroyers, and landing craft in long, deliberate lines, stretching farther than you can track. Every speech about a wall stopping this collapses in your chest at once. Brenner lowers his binoculars and says quietly that the wall was never built to stop a fleet like that. It was built to make people believe it could. What follows is not the tidy battle the training manuals described. Your column moves toward the coast through sunken lanes and hedgerow country while enemy fighters strafe anything that looks like a target. A horse goes down in its harness. A truck burns. The man beside you keeps insisting his arm is missing while both his hands are still locked around his rifle. By the time you reach the line, you have lost men without seeing a single enemy soldier up close. The unit defending this stretch of coast, part of the 352nd Infantry Division, is not the green, untested formation, later legend sometimes claims. Many of its men are combat veterans pulled back from the Eastern Front, but veteran or not, nothing in their experience prepared them for naval gunfire on this scale. Officers cannot reach headquarters. Orders contradict each other by the hour. Lucas sets up the radio near a shattered bunker while you and Brenner hold a trench above a gap in the hedgerows. American soldiers advance in small, cautious clusters rather than the tidy waves the briefings promised. You fire when Brenner tells you to. A man falls. Another drags him to cover. Killing, you discover, does not feel like an event up close. It feels like a shape at a distance, standing and then not standing, while your hands keep working from memory alone. In the afternoon, mortar rounds begin walking toward your trench. Brenner orders everyone to scatter. Lucas refuses to leave the radio because a message is finally coming through clearly. The next round lands at the bunker entrance. You come to with dirt in your mouth and a high ring in both ears. The radio is wrecked. Lucas is alive, but badly hit in the stomach, more confused than afraid. He asks you to save the pouch, not the medical kit, the pouch under the batteries, the one holding his mother's real letters. You pull it free as he grips your sleeve and makes you promise not to hand her the comfortable version. Brenner reaches you seconds later and reads the wound on Lucas's face before he says a word. The position has to be abandoned immediately. You try to lift Lucas anyway. He screams from the movement. Brenner tells you flatly that carrying him through the hedgerows under shell fire will get you both killed, and Lucas, hearing this, presses the pouch into your chest and simply says, "Go." Not as a hero's line, as an ordinary instruction, the way you might ask someone to finish a chore. You leave him with water, a pistol, and a promise of medics that may or may not arrive in time. You never confirm what happens to him. By sunset, an American patrol finds what remains of Brenner's group in an orchard. Brenner takes a round in the chest, stays upright just long enough to order everyone to stop firing, and goes down beside a tree. You raise your hands. An American soldier finds Lucas's pouch, tosses it to the ground, and levels his rifle at you until you manage the only English you can think of. Letters. Mother. He looks at the envelopes, then at you, and pushes the pouch back against your chest instead of keeping it. You are marched toward the coast as a prisoner, past truck convoys, tanks, and engineers already pouring inland. The same defensive wall your unit spent months digging is already behind the advancing lines, exactly as Brenner predicted it would be. You are shipped first to England and then across the Atlantic to a prisoner of war camp inside the United States, one of roughly 500 camps that will eventually hold close to 425,000 German prisoners on American soil before the war ends. You work farms, fix machinery, and eat more regularly than most civilians back in Bremen, a fact that feels less like relief than like guilt with a full stomach. Some prisoners stay loyal to the regime to the end and call every bad report enemy propaganda. Others go quiet as Germany collapses around news they can no longer dismiss. You keep Lucas's pouch hidden under your mattress and do not read a single letter inside it. In the spring of 1945, American newspapers begin circulating photographs from the liberated camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, bodies, starvation, survivors, staring past the camera. Guards and prisoners argue for days about whether the images are real. You recognize the instinct in yourself immediately, the pull toward whichever version of events asks the least of you. Historians still argue this point, and it remains a genuinely unsettled question rather than a closed one, over how much an individual conscript soldier like you could have known about the full scale of the killing while the war was still being fought. Access to the camps themselves was tightly restricted, but the existence of mass deportations and atrocities on the Eastern Front was, at minimum, an open secret among adults back home. You did not build the camps, you did not choose the war, but you wore the uniform of the government that built them, followed its orders, and rarely asked the kind of question that might have gotten you in trouble. That fact does not make you equal to the men who ran the camps. It also does not let you claim you were untouched by the system that made them possible. The war ends in May of 1945. Though your release does not come right away, when you finally reach Bremen in 1946, entire streets you grew up on simply no longer exist. Your father survived one raid only to die helping neighbors out of a cellar during another. Marta tells you this standing in the doorway, because there is no gentler place left in the house to say it. Emil is taller, quieter, and running what remains of the repair shop because someone had to. Your mother touches your face and tells you that you look older than you should. Nobody warned you that families keep aging while soldiers stay frozen in the last memory anyone has of them. There is no reward waiting for your return, only work, hunger, rubble, and a canvas pouch you still have not delivered. Lucas's mother lives across the city above a bakery, and you find her address within your first week home, then avoid the street for weeks after that. You tell yourself she might have moved, might already know, might be heard worse by the truth than by silence. The honest reason is simpler. You are afraid of the question she will ask, and afraid of your own answer. Your mother eventually notices the pouch and asks what it is. Something I should have delivered already, you tell her. Then every day you keep it, she says, you are choosing not to. The next morning you walk across Bremen and knock. Frau Reinhardt is smaller than you remember, her hair gone white. A photograph of Lucas standing on a shelf beside the very radio he built as a boy. She knows your name before you say it. Lucas mentioned you in the censored letters that actually reached her. She asks if he suffered. You could give her the easy version. No, it was quick. He spoke of you. He died bravely. Instead, you set the pouch on her table and tell her these are the real letters. Her hands shake as she asks whether you were with him. You say yes. She asks if you left him there. You say yes to that too. You walk her through the shelling, the ruined radio, Brenner's order, the promise Lucas made you keep. You do not ask for forgiveness, because saying it out loud would turn the whole explanation into a request for one. She opens the first letter but does not read it right away. Somebody had to carry these home to me, she says quietly. I held on to them longer than I should have, you admit. Her eyes move from the envelopes to your face, and all she says is that you did carry them home. It is not absolution. It is not condemnation either. It is simply what happened. You keep visiting after that. You repair Lucas's old radio, though there is little on the airwaves worth the effort anymore. His mother gives you one of his sketches, the Bremen railway station, drawn entirely from memory, and you hang it in the shop. Years pass. Emil becomes your partner in the business. You eventually marry, not a childhood sweetheart preserved in amber, but a nurse named Hannah, whom you meet while fixing bicycles for her hospital ward. She knows you served. She never asks for war stories you cannot give her. You have one daughter, and when she is finally old enough to ask what you did in the war, you do not tell her you were simply following orders. You tell her that ordinary people can be frightened, manipulated, and still responsible for the exact moments when they chose not to look closer. You tell her about Lucas before you tell her about yourself. You are 72 when a customer brings in a cheap plastic radio strapped to a bicycle's handlebars, barely worth the trouble of fixing. Your daughter tells you to throw it out. Instead, you open the casing and start separating the wires. And the smell of hot solder and dust pulls you straight back to a farmhouse outside a beach in Normandy and a friend who promised 2 versions of every letter. One for the censors, one for the truth. You get the connection working. Static gives way to music. Outside, Bremen goes on around you. Rebuilt streets and children and ordinary traffic moving over ground that once burned to the foundation. So, what was it actually like to be a German soldier in World War II? If you were one of the millions who never joined out of hatred and never resisted out of courage, but simply got swept up as a teenager in a machine built by older men, it was this. Obedience learned before conscience, a uniform that made you complicit whether or not you ever fired a shot that mattered, and a peace that did not arrive the day the gun stopped, because it had to be earned afterward, letter by letter, confession by confession, for the rest of your life. Your father warned you against mistaking survival for righteousness. Lucas asked you not to deliver the comfortable lie. It takes you most of your life to understand that they were asking you for exactly the same thing, and that the answer was never about the war at all. It was about what you did with the truth once you were finally free to tell it.